Welcome to the Trailhead. My name's Gene Maynard. I'm going to be your guide in this conversation. And here at the Trailhead, my intent every time is to take us a little deeper into spiritual formation country. And today, going with us is Lisa Colón DeLay. I have been benefiting myself so much from, I first encountered Lisa on Substack with a weekly offering that she makes a podcast and called Spark My Muse. It's interesting, it's thought provoking, it's theological, it's artistic, it's creative, and often explores so much on different topics within spirituality and spiritual formation. And that's where I first encountered Lisa. And then I recognized that she'd written a book, and I picked that up in the area of spiritual formation to exploration about just our inner life. Lisa, the name of the book is your first book is the wild. Yeah, the wild land
The
within. I was going to
wild
say the
land
wild
within.
space, but it's the wild land within. I heartily recommend
hmm
that you check that out. And one of the reasons I'm having a conversation with Lisa, just introducing you to her, and she's very graciously made available a discount for you to be able to pick up what she does on Substack, and I'll put that offer in the notes below this podcast. But she's releasing a second book. It'll be out later this year. I think that's accurate, towards the end of this year. And it's called The Way of the Desert Elders. And it's an exploration of some of the desert fathers, desert mothers who, at an early portion of church history, left the Roman surrounding culture and went out into the desert. And if we might think that strange today, well, in that era, they were regarded in time as some of the best of the ones who were on the frontier and exploring in deep ways Christian spirituality. And they became incredibly impactful in ways that we might not be able to imagine today. So I want you to meet Lisa. I want you to meet the desert fathers and mothers and just that whole kind of spirituality that's attached to that. So with all of that, Lisa, thank you so much for spending some time with me here on the Trailhead.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Gene. I've really appreciated your work. Tune in every time you put something out. I really enjoy it. Spiritual formation is my jam, and that's where my heart's cry is. It's a reason why I'm bringing these forgotten voices back, because they teach us so much about forming spiritually and becoming more like Jesus.
Yeah, so let's dive into that and how you became acquainted with and became interested in the desert spirituality, that whole section. And I kind of want to put this under an umbrella and like, what's a nice person like you doing out in the desert? So what inspired your interest in the desert mothers and the desert fathers, and when did you decide that you, a 21st century woman, really wanted to
Mhm.
explore this almost unknown for us in the West, a branch of Christian spirituality? Can you tell us a little bit about that in your own journey?
Yeah, and thank you for asking that. It is really strange that the 300s to the 600s is about where I'm focusing for this. It's a whole bunch of people that went out to the desert, and some of them lived as hermits, and they also formed communities, which became monasticism, proto-monasticism, which of course in Europe reigned for 1,000 years and kept things cohesive during the Middle Ages. But for me, it was an introduction to Evagrius Ponticus, who had been the archbishop in Constantinople at the time, was the capital of Rome. So he was a big shot. He was as high up as you get, and was from privilege and wealth and education. He had it all. And I wound up finding out that his ideas and the things that he wrote in the desert were the precursors of the 7 deadly sins, which were written later on by Pope Gregory. And I realized there was a whole bunch of wisdom and stories and all these lives I had known very little about, except for maybe Anthony the Great, because I had heard there's this desert hermit, Anthony the Great. But other than that, I didn't realize that at one time, there were 500,000 people living this way in the desert, and they were leaving the institutionalized church that had been taken over by Rome and the empire for the aims of empire, the influence of empire. Christianity at the institutional level was getting very twisted. They were forgetting about the poor and the orphan and the widow. And so people redoubled their efforts. And I loved what they had to say about devotion. Now, they were ascetics, so they took some extreme, they were in the desert, so they didn't have much there anyway, but they also would frequently fast, and they would, of course, they were all celibate, and they wouldn't marry, they wouldn't have children. So it was pretty austere. And so in a way, it's not like our world today, but I found that there were so many spiritual fathers and especially spiritual mothers I had known nothing about. And I realized this was a great time to bring their stories back.
You can probably kind of fact check for me an understanding that I have of Antony the Great. I might sort of have an apocryphal understanding of a moment, but I think I have heard, or at least I've read as I've studied a bit about him, that when he went out into the desert, of course, he was seeking solitude and lived a life of what I suppose most of us would call extreme solitude for quite a period of time. But here's the part that I want you to fact check. I think he became kind of wildly popular. I think people really started
Uh-huh.
to understand who he was, admire who he was, and other young men in particular wanted to join him. I'm probably making up a couple of things here, but in a sense, his ability to live a life of solitude became compromised because of how popular he began. So, or became so
Mm.
true.
I'd say I would give you a B plus. B plus. What I would say is that absolutely he lived a life of solitude. And so there were a few other people doing the same thing. He is sometimes given this honorific of father of the monks. And he wasn't the first one, but he had such a great personality. He wasn't pretentious and people just loved him. And when we think about living in solitude, it's one of the things that's important for our modern minds to kind of figure out, since we live in an age of convenience where if I want some good or service, I can pretty much click something and it'll be delivered in an hour, a day. We have to remember that Anthony could not have existed without the help of the church, even
Sure.
in his hermetic solitude. So they would bring him things he needed, like food or maybe water or whatever it might be once in a while. He wouldn't really socialize with them, but they might say, will you pray for me, Anthony? Or will you give me a blessing? Or sometimes he did healings. And they would kind of keep begging him, come out and teach us, come out and teach us. And he, for years, for decades, he said, no, I'm doing this devotion to God. I'm ridding myself of all these demons that I have and all these afflicting thoughts. And then finally, I think it was at least 30 years, then he came out of solitude and he taught them for about 5 or 6 years, maybe it's 6 or 7 years. And then he went back into solitude, but it was only solitude in a certain kind of way. This is where he would regularly come out and teach, and sometimes he would travel. And so he was a little more accepting of people in his life and the interactions. And then he wrote some ordinances for hermetic communal life in the desert, because as people came out to the desert and lived as hermits, they would also each Sunday or sometimes on the weekends get together and worship together, or maybe have a priest come in and do a litany or Eucharist and the liturgy, the divine liturgy. So as much as we think that they were completely all alone, which they were most of the time, living in these little huts and praying and fasting and maybe weaving rope as they did it, or singing songs, they also did get together with each other. They didn't forsake the community of believers. They would meet with them on a fairly regular basis. And they also needed to be supplied with food, except for
Okay.
the grazing hermits. And there's a couple
Yeah.
grazing hermits who just lived off of like whatever they could find out there.
So such an interesting group. So what, in your understanding of it, what did they find in the desert that they couldn't find inside of Roman culture or inside of the church of the time? So they, I loved how you expressed that. Now they did live lives of solitude for sure, but they also gathered from time to time. So they are bringing an impulse for community with them into the desert. What did they find out there, if I can say it like that they couldn't find
Uh-huh.
where they'd come from?
Well, especially for the wealthy who left for the desert, there were some people who had lives of complete luxury, hundreds and hundreds of slaves at their disposal to do their bidding, to do anything they want, multiple estates, all the clothing, anything you could ever want. Some of those people left. That's kind of the most shocking of all. You can kind of understand when people would leave for maybe they were on the run from authorities, or they owed debt, or they were poor and they had nothing else, or widows would come because the church wasn't taking care of them. And they think, maybe this community, although I'd have next to nothing, I will still have people looking after me. But the Roman government was imposing on the church and infiltrating it to the degree that it became a place where you could do careerism and become a cleric. If you were wealthy, you could have a son move up as a priest and gain power and prestige through the church, which was the opposite of this peasant religion of the peasant Messiah and all of the attitudes of Jesus. When you compare the Sermon on the Mount, it was becoming this warped, wealthy situation with empire imposing on the institutional church. So people couldn't get that in some of their areas. They couldn't get that devout, authentic Christianity. They were getting this twisted, warped, compromised, and corrupted version of Christianity, and they were not up for it. They wanted to get away from that and become refined spiritually. They wanted to purge themselves of the luxuries and trappings of the world and of empire. Excuse me. And so, just like Jesus did in the wilderness before his ministry, 40 days in the desert, just like John the Baptist and some of the prophets, they knew that they could go to a place that was worthless to everybody else, but would be very powerful and potent for them in seeking devotion with God and seeking intimacy with God. So they couldn't find that with all the trappings of empire. And it's amazing how many wealthy people left their lives for and gave it up.
So it's like what I think I hear you saying, that the same impulse that we sometimes have to try to get back to a simpler, more authentic way of following Christ. They were feeling that too after 2 or 3 centuries of Roman culture development and co-opting of the church and so on. So I guess that's a universal instinct inside of all of us, but to a way that I haven't maybe, or most of us maybe don't in the West, they actually followed that impulse. So,
right. It was definitely an impulse.
Yeah. What is a story or two, maybe a character or two that really has grabbed your attention and you now think, even if I would have never written anything about this, and you've written beautifully about it, but even if I hadn't, just knowing this story or knowing this character just has so enriched who I am.
Oh my goodness, it's so hard to pick. You sent that question ahead of time, and I thought, oh no, I have to pick a favorite. It's like picking a favorite child. There are a few that are so beloved to me now, and I'd say that I'm going to have to narrow it down to 4, 2 men and 2 women. One is Abba Moses, and he was Ethiopian. He was a very large, big black man, and he came from a really treacherous background where he was actually a thief, a murderer, and he ran away, and he happened upon the community as he was running away from authorities, and his life change was amazing and miraculous, and he became the patron saint of nonviolence, and his story is so beautiful. His transformation is so inspiring, and I never knew a thing about him, and he's just very inspiring. The next person is kind of his opposite in size, because he was a dwarf. Had dwarfism, and it was Abba John. Really beautiful person who people just adored him. They said, the one Desert Father said of him, that he had the whole community wrapped around his little finger because he was such a precious person to them. And these people spent many years in service to others in the community, and to grow in humility and to rid themselves of all of the vices that we think of, like greed and wrath and all the different vices that we hope to rid ourselves of when we're trying to become like Christ. And then there's the 2 women that I'll mention, but there's quite a few women that I mentioned in the book, and I wound up telling their stories, and their backgrounds are completely fascinating. But both of these women happen to come from wealthy backgrounds. And one of them is Amma Matrona, and she wound up, after a series of events, which I won't get into, she wound up starting her own community, her own religious community. And I have a quote from her that she gives us inspiration about, you don't have to leave to go to the desert to become a person who becomes purified in devotion. She says, many people living secluded lives on the mountain have perished by living like people in the world. It is better to live in a crowd and want a solitary life than to live a solitary life all the time, be longing for company. And so she talks about it's the mindset of the person. It's not just where you run to seek devotion. And the final one is Amma Sinclairica, and she was just another woman who started her own community for women, and people adored her. And she has so many wise sayings. She came from a seafaring background, and her parents and her family were merchants. And so a lot of times when she does a quote, she'll relate it to sailing the sea or shipbuilding or something like that. And it was just such a delight to meet all of these people.
Well, I want to just say to those of you who are tapping into this podcast, that I've had a chance. It's such a privilege to get a chance to kind of just preview a little bit of what Lisa's writing in the way of the desert elders, and the stories she tells, like she's just told us. The stories that she tells in this book are so fascinating. And one of the things that I loved about the fact is I don't know nearly as much about either the fathers or the mothers as you do. I know a little bit more about the fathers than the mothers. And that's probably true of maybe a lot of Western Christians. But it was so interesting for me to make sure to see that you've highlighted some of the women who were so impactful, not just inside of a circle of women, but for all of us inside of Christianity. So I love that.
Hmm.
It's such a you write so beautifully, and I can't wait to pick up a copy myself. And I want to make sure I'll keep telling all of you who are listening to this that this will be a great resource for you. And in your churches, if you're in ministry, it would be a great study group to be able to take people into a deeper understanding of this really rich portion of Christianity that here in the West we've largely lost sight of. So, speaking of these desert fathers and mothers, and they go in to remote areas, and your story of the mother who said, well, it's not really about the location, it's about your mindset, it's about your heart. But they go into a remote location with a mindset and a heart to become purified. I'm curious how you think they would evaluate two things: our culture today, and then secondly, our Western church. Both of those are, nothing's monolithic, because church isn't
Right.
just one thing, culture is not just one thing. But in
Hmm.
general, from their vantage point, how would they look at what we're doing with um, just all of the pieces, the noise, the pace of life, the
Hmm.
technology, the loud things that divide us and so on in our culture. So
Right.
jump in where you want.
Yeah, I think they would agree with plenty of us and say that we're ripe for another type of revival that brings back certain ascetic practices or certain reductions or relinquishments or renunciations of certain things, or at least putting them in their place. Because, and I'm speaking from a nerd technological point of view too. I like trying out AI models. I love all that stuff, but there's something to be said for making sure we have stillness, solitude, and silence as a major component in our lives, wherever we find ourselves. It is so important for our soul hygiene, if you will, for our spiritual formation, and for how we relate to others so that we don't objectify others and think of them as tools or objects that should please us and satisfy us. We start treating people pretty quickly when we're in a technological framework as just, buttons on our keyboard or something, instead of these image bearers of God. When we pull back and get our humanity back by stripping our lives of some of these things, even just being out in nature more would probably help this. We can see each other, I think, with more compassionate eyes and more Christ-like eyes. I think we're perfectly ripe for something like this. I think that they would walk beside us, encourage us to put down our tech once in a while, or sometimes, or make new commitments of how we want to live our lives. And they do walk beside us. That's kind of why I've wanted to revive their stories. Their wisdom, plenty of their wisdom is not stuck in time. It could just be completely applied right now. And I think it's time we listen to them, especially the forgotten ones we didn't even know were around. They certainly would guide us in a more less encumbered, I guess you could say, life that isn't so busy and contaminated with distractions and noise.
I loved your word "less encumbered." They push the envelope of that, and it was so interesting, isn't it? Well, Anthony is one that I know when he was early on, he's battling all of the encumbrances inside of him, if I can use that word. But
Yeah.
it's such a yeah. There's so many. I'm so curious about where all this could go inside of contemporary spirituality, contemporary expressions, community expressions of church and gatherings and
Mm.
so on. But if someone someone like me who started becoming aware of the Desert Fathers later in my
Hmm.
life, or someone who is really interested in deeper life with God, but really hasn't
Hmm.
explored much the Desert Fathers, before your book comes out, where would you say they could start digging? Certainly your book will help, but before that comes out, where could they
Hmm.
start digging to just learn a little more?
Well, I did a lot of research and I found I'm going to wind up having this huge list of places and books you can read. Once the book comes out, it'll be in the back of the book. What's interesting about some of these writings that Evagrius did, not everybody did writings, but he was so educated that once he got to the desert, he did some. You can read the translations of them. You can just look them up and read them. And there's going to be some, I would say that wouldn't be the first place I would start because there's some distance in our time and culture. So there's a couple that I would recommend, a few books I'd recommend that I used in my research. First, I would say for sure, subscribe to my podcast and subscribe to my Substack, because I've already covered Desert Fathers and Mothers. I've already kind of done introductions, and I will continue to do that in the ramp up to my book, as well as next the book will actually come out in January next year, right before Lent. And I will have a devotional that anybody can get, whether they get the book or not. And it will guide us through the time of Lent with a desert father and mother that you wind up picking based on what you'd like to learn along the way. And so that's a way to kind of ease people into who are these people? What were they all about? Because some people know them as ascetics who what they never did anything fun or they never ate good food, but who are they really? And then finally, I will recommend 3 books that I think are a great way to begin to dig in. One of them is called, and I can send these to you also to put in your notes. One is called Balance of the Heart, Desert Spirituality for 21st Century Christians. And that's by Mother Lois Farag. And she is a Coptic Orthodox Christian. So she comes from that part of the world, Egypt, and she comes from the eastern side of Christianity. So she has great insights on some of the stuff we miss as Westerners. I'd start there on their terms. And then there's also Forgotten Desert Mothers. So some people have never even known there were desert mothers. And there were communities and places in the desert where women outnumbered men 2-1. I was stunned to find that out. So this one's called Forgotten Desert Mothers, Sayings, Lives, and Stories of the Early Christian Women by Laura Swan. And then the final one I'll recommend is a classic, and people usually, there's one by Thomas Merton too, but Henry Nouwen has made one that was a while ago. It's from a distinctly Western lens, but it gives a little entry point of the desert spirituality in general. And it's called The Way of the Heart, The Spirituality of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. All of those are great entry points. And I use some of what they've done in my book as well. But I really pepper my book with a lot of quotes that can be used devotionally or whatever. And then each chapter will end in some reflection questions and prayer. And so it's not just a book that's just history and fun and stories, but I'm hoping that it's actually transformational, that we really metabolize it and take it in and allow it to change us.
Yeah, I would agree. I think your book is going to do that. I'm already a big fan. So, Lisa, appreciate so much you spending some time just helping me and helping others who joined this to just appreciate a little more and to grab some resources that will help us be able to explore that Christianity didn't just suddenly emerge in the 21st century, but there's so many expressions that would be for us and the desert fathers and mothers. And I love again, I just want to say, I love again the fact that you are helping us understand there are women. And it's a great statement. I just heard that again. I read that what you said it again. In some places, women outnumbered men in the desert 2-1. That's an astounding thing, actually. Just recognize very impressive. So thank you again. So I want to make sure I'm going to put into notes Lisa's Substack or podcast. I follow. I enjoy very much, and I would encourage you to tap into it as well and take advantage of what she produces for helping us understand this way of being a spiritual person. So, Lisa, thank you, and it's been a joy to get to talk with you. I hope it's the first of many times that we talk in the future. Thank you very much. It's been a blessing for me.
Likewise. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
You bet.